I am looking for Chris Creamer.
This is Chris Creamer.
Chris Creamer, it's Mike Richards calling from rawmicrichards.com. We're live right now, just so you know. So if you want to say something bad about your mom or whatever's going on in your life, just know they're probably watching.
All right. Well, thanks for the heads up. I'll watch the swears.
Yeah. And by the way, am I calling, is this Port Perry?
Yeah. We're just north of Oshawa here.
Okay. So let's talk about some local logos. I mean, you saw when Newcastle and they ripped off the Minnesota North Stars. Don't get me started on the Uxbridge Bruins. Seriously, Uxbridge, that's the best you could come up with, honestly. At least Stouffville had the decency to just put their name on it.
Well, how about you're completely forgetting about the Port Perry Mojacks.
Oh, is that what they call them now? They never did when I was a kid. The Mojacks?
The Mojacks. It's named after some old-time restaurant or business. It was called Mother Jackson's, so they just shortened the name to Mojacks.
Oh, I might have known that one. Isn't that where the butter tarts came from or something like that? I don't know.
I don't know.
Yeah,
I'm not that up on Port Perry history.
I was going to say, but you certainly are up on logos and sportslogos.net. Of course, they can get on Twitter or they can go and see the incredible array of not only logos days gone by, but just sort of the coolness of the artwork, I would say, that goes into it. So what was appealing for you? I mean, why start a website like this? Because I know it's immensely popular, but for you, what was the genesis of this?
Well, really, I mean, we're talking 21 years ago I started this website, and I was just a kid, right, 13, 14 years old, looking for an excuse to make a website. Back in those early days, there wasn't a lot of websites out there, and I was really just interested in the technology behind it. And just growing up, I noticed I was always doodling on school notebooks, drawing logos from the NHL, Major League Baseball, making up my own teams. To have my own sort of fake leagues, I would play with the kids in the neighborhood. And when it came to coming up with an idea for a site, my dad suggested, hey, you're always doodling those logos. Why don't you just put them all up on the computer? And from there, it really took off.
And for you, now you did something where you broke down what you felt were the top. How many? How far did you go with this?
With what? Sorry.
The top, was it top?
Yeah, the NHL. I believe you were working hand in hand with NHL.com, Chris, with the
Correct,
top 25 logos. Can you explain how this came about? And did they talk to you about it, saying, "Listen, we love your site," which obviously they should and they do. Can you help organize something like this for the 100th anniversary? How did it all come about? Because we'll talk about the top 10 in a bit, but just the genesis of how this actually came through. Considering this is a major year in the history of the National Hockey League.
Right, absolutely. So last year, or 2016, they came to me about a project they were interested in doing for the centennial year, and it was to just sort of catalog and do the sort of definitive history of NHL team logos once and for all. So there's all these different contrasting timelines, especially back in the early days, 20s and 30s, where I would have a certain set of logos, they would have a certain set of logos, and they didn't really mix up well. So they came to me, said, hey, let's sort of get together and figure out the actual timeline for all these logos. And they had me down at the Hockey Hall of Fame Resource Center in Etobicoke, which is just an amazing place if you can get into it, going through all the old programs, game-worn jerseys, and just trying to figure out exactly what was worn when. And from that project, which they deemed successful, they came to me a few months later and said, we're planning on doing this list of the greatest NHL uniforms, and we want to do a fan vote to determine which is the best of all time. So they came to me. They asked me to put together a list of 150 uniforms, try to spread it out across as many eras, as many teams as possible. Throw in some designs that you might personally not like because everyone has different tastes.
Yeah.
And so I presented them with this list of 150. We pared it down to 100. And put it all together and threw it out there to the fans. A lot of the designs in the 100 there I'm not personally a fan of, especially the sort of the mid-2000s when Reebok got involved and started throwing piping all over everything. I personally can't stand that design stuff, but we threw it in there in case people disagreed, and largely none of those designs made it to the top 25.
Yeah, so Chris, was there actually a criteria? So there was you and so it wasn't you alone, but I mean, can you sort of give us an idea of like purely artistic. You talked about a lot of things. I mean, it really is art. I mean, this is what we're talking about. So how do you sort of balance that? Because as we know, art is very subjective. What one person thinks is amazing, the other person thinks is garbage.
Also, for the 100 uniforms that we chose to be a part of this poll, for the most part, we tried to spread it out. Like I was saying, we wanted to pick at least 5 or 6 uniforms for each original 6 team, 3 or 4 uniforms for the expansion 6, and at least 1 for some of the more newer teams, and then try to hit at least 1 from every single season worn in NHL history. We didn't want to ignore the Montreal Wanderers, even though it could be easy to do so. So when it came down to should we pick the Vancouver Canucks? Should we put in that big, ugly V uniform that they wore in the early 80s, or should we leave it out? And at that time, it's it's a unique enough design. It's iconic enough. People still talk about it. Even if it's ugly, let's put it in there just so people can vote on it and have their say. So a lot of times there were logos, like I said, or uniforms that I disagreed with in terms of the actual design, but I figured they should be a part of it because they're so memorable and so historic in the history of the league.
So no surprise, the only reason I say no surprise, Chris, and we'll talk about our top 10, this top 10 that was addressed with the Chicago Blackhawks being the number 1 uniform in NHL history. The only reason I say no surprise, Chris, is because when I talk jerseys with friends and we include every single major sport in North America, Major League Baseball, the CFL, the NFL, everything, the Blackhawks for me not only are the best NHL logo, but it could be the best logo in sports, in my opinion. Like that jersey itself, the red Blackhawk jersey, whether you like the team or not, and I'm a Jets fan, so this is a Central Division rival. This jersey is, I don't think it's second to nothing in sports today.
Oh, absolutely, and I agree with you. And you try to figure out why. What makes this uniform so special? What makes this logo so special? And it's a combination of several things. You got a very sort of historic, traditional design, which has survived the test of time now. It's been largely untouched since the 1950s at this point. And, I mean, you see how often the Maple Leafs tinker with their uniforms, or the Bruins. They're always sort of messing around with it. The Blackhawks haven't done anything for the last 70 years in terms of their uniform. It's got a nice, bright, vibrant red color as the base. And to contrast that, you have the dark black and white stripes. You have hints of pretty much every color imaginable thrown throughout the uniform. And it's so subtle that you might not even notice that the Blackhawks have green on their uniform, have blue, have yellow, have orange. And they're just thrown in there so nicely and so subtly, but it all works together. And it doesn't hurt that you look back to old film or old photos of guys like Bobby Hull, Stan Mikita, the Espositos, and you see them wearing the exact same uniform that Patrick Kane's wearing as he lifts the Stanley Cup over his head. Things like that. You mix them all together, throw them into a pot, and you got yourself a memorable, historic uniform.
Well, Chris, when John Candy wore it on the beach in Florida, that to me was the sealer for greatest of all time. He's one of the all-time beauties, but I agree with everything that you're saying, and there's that feeling of it being traditional. But I also think, too, it's amazing. There are certain logos and teams that come up, and there's this glazed-over look that sometimes that people get, and I have to admit that the Hartford Whalers, when that name comes up, period, the logo is so ingrained in your mind for a team that doesn't exist, and yet there is there's this esoteric sort of by those that not only necessarily nostalgically miss the team or the brass bonanza, but it's the logo. The logo simply has never gone away.
No, to me, it's my favorite all-time logo, the Hartford Whalers, and it's just the perfect sort of combination of a bunch of elements all thrown together that when you look at them individually, they all make sense. And then mixed together, they even make even more sense. It's very simple, very not too complicated. You have the W for the team, you have the whale tail at the top, and in between the whale tail and the W, you have the letter H for Hartford. It's so brilliant, so simple. It's up there with a team like the Milwaukee Brewers, their old baseball glove logo.
Yeah.
When I found out that I used to laugh, they have a baseball glove for their logo, how silly. And then my dad would say, that's an M and a B put together, right? And that it sort of opened my mind, and sort of I think that might have gotten me into logos more than anything. Just seeing that there's these little hidden stories in between everything, and that little H, that silly little H in between the whale tail and the W on the Whalers logo, that really seals it for me. And the uniforms with the little cartoon whale on the shoulders. I mean, how could you hate that?
Yeah. Hey, Chris, and we're in conversation, by the way, with Chris Creamer. He's sportslogos.net. If you haven't been there, what the hell's taking you so long? Get there. You talk about stories about logos and kind of the background, and you talk about spending some time in the archives at the Hall of Fame and so forth. Is there any story that you like off the top of your head about why a logo was made for a certain team where it's like, okay, that's something I didn't know, because I you follow it a lot, you research a lot, you know the history of it, but then you're like, I love that story on why they decided to go with this, maybe a third jersey or the actual jersey itself. Is there anything like that out there that kind of perked your attention and went, you know what, that's pretty cool?
Off the top of my head, you're putting me on the spot a little here. The Nashville Predators, well, maybe I don't really like the logo so much, but the story behind it is kind of interesting in that these guys were digging up for construction for some convention center in the 70s, and while they were digging it up, they found the fossilized skeleton of a saber-toothed tiger. And they brought it out and they put it on display, and then 20 years later, they get a hockey team, and they don't even have a name for the team yet. They're like, well, we're using this saber-toothed tiger fossil as our logo. And behind that, it's like, it makes sense. Why is a team from Nashville, a saber-toothed tiger? And,
yeah.
Oh, that's why, because they found a fossil in the 70s. And then
I
from
didn't
that
know
logo,
that.
they build a name around it.
Well, and as you know, Chris, now there is an enormous, in this society where there's sensitivities towards everything. Logos do not avoid that kind of targeting where you look at the Blackhawks because it's, Métis or Indigenous, whatever word you want to put with it. You wonder if you would still be able to have an igloo somehow on a Nordique, logo. You look at some of the other professional teams that have anything to do with, the Washington Redskins, all those kinds of things. You just kind of wonder that, did those logos last? Do you think that, under scrutiny of the pressures that we see right now in society where there is a real backlash against something that's perceived to be either bigoted or racist, do you think the logos survive?
I don't know if any one logo will forever survive, unless it's a team like the Canadiens or the Yankees. Do you put the Blackhawks up there with that? Maybe who? It's hard to predict where things will go with opinions in the future. I certainly wouldn't have predicted some of the opinions that we have now. To me, I see differences between a team like the Blackhawks and a team like the Indians in terms of what they do now. Ancestry DNA says I'm 93% European, so ultimately my opinion doesn't really matter for this. However, I can see big differences between, sort of a racially insensitive caricature like the Cleveland Indians use, or a name like the Redskins, versus the Blackhawks, who, to me, it looks like the logo is more like a respectful depiction of a First Nations person, decorated and honored. So, like I say, ultimately my opinion doesn't really matter when it comes to this. However, I would love to see the Blackhawks continue to use a logo like that. I hear there's people contemplating a change to names like the Edmonton Eskimos.
Yeah.
So you raise a good point. Would the Nordiques be able to bring back the igloo logo? How many people knew it was an igloo? So that might not be so much of an issue. But that's a very interesting question, and it's. I hope that one day we're able to debate what the Nordique's new logo will look like.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I totally agree with you, Chris. Okay, so the top 10. We'll fire up a quick graphic of the top 10 from the poll itself. And, we talk about the Blackhawks, the Whalers, the Ducks, Nordiques, North Stars, Sabres, Red Wings, Oilers, Canadiens, and Winnipeg Jets. And that's the Jets logo from the 1990s. Out of that top 10, is there one of the logos, and I got one in my mind. I'll tell you it once. I'll ask you the same question. Is there one logo or two logos that you're actually surprised that crack the top 10 where you thought, man, I did not think this logo would crack the top 10?
Well, in terms of, I knew people would pick certain logos on there that I wouldn't have selected. A team like the Mighty Ducks, I wouldn't have put
that's
top
the one.
10.
That's the one, too. I'm going, no, not the duck one. No ducks. What are you doing? No ducks.
But that's not your question. Your question was, you're surprised in the top 10. I knew it'd be in the top 10 because I knew people.
See, I'm surprised it was. But yeah, I should have addressed that a little bit differently. Yeah. But so you know people like that. I'm surprised people like that.
It's because the people who were kids when that came out, and the kids loved that logo when it came out in the early '90s, and it's hard to blame them. It's kind of fun. You put on your 7-year-old ball cap for a second there and pretend what it's like.
True.
To see that logo when it comes out for the first time. I know my brother loved it, and he was only about 7 years old when that happened. And now those kids, they've grown up. It's been 25 years now. Those kids are in their 30s. They got money, and they want to see that logo back. They want to relive those memories of seeing that logo on the ice. And it's hard to blame them. I put on my own, I think back to my own years growing up, and I mean, I'd love to see the Whalers come back, and I would love to see the old Nordiques uniforms come back, or in any sport, like the old New England Patriots or Tampa Bay Buccaneers uniforms. So, to some people, what I might think is great is silly, but it's what I grew up with, and it's what I remember, and it's what the league looked like when I fell in love with the game. So I can understand how those people now grow up and they fall in love with it, and they want it back, and they buy anything that has it on there. In terms of, I'm surprised to see the Winnipeg Jets from the 90s so high on there. I know you're a Jets fan. But to me, there's really nothing special at all about that particular logo.
Okay, here we go. All right, Chris, you just don't know. It was going so well.
No wonder you didn't want to come into studio. Okay. No, you know what? I'll give you this, Chris. Living in Winnipeg at the time where they made the jersey change and the logo change, I didn't like it either, because if somebody tells me, and I've said this to my wife, that 80s logo of the Winnipeg Jets, the one that Dale Hawerchuk wore, the one that introduced the world to the Jets of the NHL, that's their best logo. That's the logo I want on my gravestone one day. That is my number one, and that's why I'm kind of surprised that logo not only made the top 10 but finished ahead of the Mount Rushmore of my logo life kind of thing.
Right, and not only that, it finished ahead of the Toronto Maple Leafs, which is just bizarre.
Now, I think the one I'm glad, and you mentioned Vancouver, which was the weird. It looked like there was some sort of uniform that NASA came up with when they went to Mars. I don't it's like a bad science fiction movie, but the Captain Highlander Islanders jerseys that made you literally seasick just looking at them. To me, historically, one of the worst jerseys of all time.
I would agree with you, but here we go, Mighty Ducks syndrome. People are starting to fall in love with that again.
Oh no!
Everything goes in cycles.
Yeah.
They brought it back when it was their last season at the Coliseum. They wore them before the game as like a special throwback warm-up jersey, and people went nuts for them. And people were more upset that they weren't the exact design of the old uniforms. It was just sort of the old logo thrown on a blank jersey. People love them. I don't know why. There's no great memories associated with those Islanders teams, unless you really, really miss Ziggy Palffy. And so, I did like the lighthouse logo they used on the shoulder. I think they could probably bring that back in some capacity now. But those uniforms are just nauseating. Almost literally.
Just talk to the play-by-play guys who had to do it of that era. They hated them. They could barely see the numbers. It was just everything was a disaster. Chris, thanks so much for joining us here this morning. It's one of those things that what you do for a living and what this represents is basically the love of the game, and then the artistic side of how those two worlds sort of intercede with each other, and that's why guys can kill time with it. I'm sure that you must get a lot of hits during the day when guys are in their cubicles or in their office. And they start they start to wonder, I wonder what it looked. Those Leaf jerseys in about 1979, and then all of a sudden they see the other jersey. Now, is it NHL only, or is it just hockey? Like, what is the actual website?
On my site, it's everything, every sport, every league, every level. You could do speaking of hockey in particular, NHL, AHL, OHL, we do all the leagues, and then we do the same thing in baseball, football, soccer, all around the world, as far back as the 1800s. Every team you could think of. Yeah, it's a full-time job.
So do you have one? I mean, because you've seen it all. You've seen all these sports. Like for me, there's a couple of football jerseys, like the classic, I would say, Hamilton Tiger Cat jerseys of the mid to late 70s. I loved it. I loved the colors. I loved the stripes down the sleeves. I talked to Dave about that vintage New York Jets. The green with the white sleeve. What to you is your favorite? I mean, any sport, when you look at it, you go, okay, that's the jersey I need to have, and maybe you have many of them.
I have about 70 or 80. Yeah, I got enough. My wife would agree too. If I was to pick my sort of dream matchup to see in person, just based on uniforms alone, I would love to see the Red Wings at the Canadiens. That's something you could see now. I mean, the Red Wings road white uniforms and the Canadiens home red with that blue stripe across the chest. It's looked exactly the same for the last 70, 80 years, that matchup, and I'll never get tired of it.
Yeah, that's a great point.
If we could do dark-on-dark uniforms, the Red Wings against the Leafs would look great. Red Wings in red, Leafs in blue, just that head-to-toe all in red, head-to-toe all in blue with just white stripes. Beautiful. Very simple, very beautiful, very traditional.
Yeah.
Chris, thanks so much for joining us here today on rawmickrichards.com. We appreciate it. It's a great site. Once again, sportslogos.net. Been a lot of fun here this morning. You take care, and we'll talk to you again soon.
Sounds good. Thanks a lot, guys.
Thanks, Chris.
That is Chris Creamer. Once again, sportslogos.net. I know you're going to go to it now. And
What? Did we just become best friends?
Yep.